Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to More Than One Main Character, listening to and sharing community voices. My name is Amy Cohen, and I'm the board president for Cultural Connections. I'm so glad to see everyone who's here today on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. As you likely know, since you are here, Cultural Connections is a nonprofit, volunteer-run community of Bay Area museum, arts, and culture professionals. Our mission is to provide a platform to connect, exchange ideas, and share resources to inspire creativity and action. Our programming highlights and shares the rich talent and resources of our local museum community and community abroad and across the US, as you will see today. And our programs are always free for Cultural Connections members. So if you are not yet a member, you may want to consider joining today. We have more programs in the works for the rest of the year, so stay tuned for announcements on those. We are very glad to be joined today by our three esteemed panelists who will be introduced in just a few seconds. For that, I will turn it over to Kara Dodge, who is a member of Cultural Connections Board. Kara has been a museum professional since 2007 and has enjoyed a number of different positions in science-focused institutions. She currently serves as the exhibit manager at NASA Ames Research Center. And Kara will do a bit of Zoom housekeeping and get us started on the program and introduce us to our wonderful panelists today. So thank you again, everyone, for being here, and we are in for an awesome program. So get ready, and then Kara, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everybody. Big welcome to all of our Cultural Connections members. Also, anybody else who's joining us today. We really appreciate all of the great response that we've got for everybody about this program. I am so excited to moderate for you today. I want to just take a couple of quick seconds and just kind of run through how we're going to use Zoom today. So there are two features that we're going to be using during this session today. You've already hopefully been introduced to the chat, where you can share comments, links, anything that you're interested in that you want other people to know about. Feel free to share in the chat. Just be sure that you select all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, your chats are just coming to myself and the other panelists. If you want, we will have a section of this program later today that is going to be audience questions. So we do invite you to add in some questions. But I am going to ask that you please use the Q&A function of Zoom for any questions. So again, chat for any chats that you want to add, comments, kudos, whatever you like, but please use the Q&A function for your questions. All right, so I'm going to get started and introduce all of our wonderful panelists. I'm going to start with Penny Jennings. Penny Jennings is the Oakland Museum of California's Associate Director of Experience Development. Prior to joining OMCA, she worked on a wide variety of projects at museums and exhibit design firms in the Bay Area, including the Exploratorium, the Bay Area Discovery Museum, and West Office Exhibition Design. Penny is a graduate of the Jfku Museum Studies program, a past president of Cultural Connections, and currently serves as the president of the National Association for Museum Exhibition, or NAME. Welcome, Penny. Next, I'd like to introduce Brad Larson. Brad Larson has focused on adding visitor stories to exhibits for over 20 years. His story kiosk installations have been incorporated in children's museums, science museums, and local history museums across the country. He started in the museum field as technology developer at Boston Children's Museum, where he had a special interest in how families communicate in exhibits. And since then, he's been expanding his focus into community storytelling and pop-up exhibits. His hobbies include writing haiku and jumping around with a stick. Welcome, Brad. And then last, but of course not least, is Sarah Cider. Sarah Cider is a senior science writer at the Exploratorium. Her goal as an exhibit developer is to help people think deeply and critically about the role of science in society. She's tackled that work as associate curator of natural sciences at the Oakland Museum, as lead content developer at Berkeley, and as consulting exhibition developer at the United States Botanic Garden. Before all that, she completed a PhD in biology at the University of North Carolina, where she studied butterflies and climate. In her spare time, Sarah volunteers with her local Code for America Brigade to make Oakland's city government more equitable and accessible. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome to all three of my panelists. Thank you very much for joining today. And I'm just going to launch right in. I would love to hear first from you, Brad. Tell us a little bit about how and why you use community stories in a recent project.
Okay, so I see I've unmuted myself. Also had a question. Were we also going to show slides prior to this, or are we going to jump into the question series now?
Brad, if you would like to show us some of your content and your slides, show them now.
Sure. Yeah, so maybe that'd be a good start because I think that'll set the context for some of the answers too. And I also wanted to acknowledge what challenging, interesting times we're having this meeting in. As I was thinking about it, we've been coming to these sessions for a long time, but this is a very unique set of circumstances. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about how do I respond to this change in circumstances and also how do museums. And so hopefully we can explore that question as we go along. So I wanted to show a little overview. Now the second tricky thing will be screen sharing, which I think we've got down and practiced that. So I'm going to show just a few slides quickly, and then we can go from there. So first, I wanted to show a little bit of sort of a process of community storytelling in exhibits. There are really three different approaches. One is to think about the exhibit itself, and this was the Mercer Museum, one of my favorites, where we asked people to show us their shoes and then tell a story about their shoes. So what stories do your shoes have to tell? Another quick one, this is California Science Center for the Dogtails exhibit that's currently traveling around. And again, the kinds of questions that we're asking there are, how did you know your dog was the one for you? And what's your favorite memory with your dog? At the Boston Mini Maker Fair, we set up a station to record people's puppet shows together. So kids and parents would do puppet shows and make puppets out of spoons. So that's another mode. That's sort of the pop-up exhibit mode. So we've seen the exhibit mode, and now we've got the pop-up exhibit mode. And this is the next level on pop-up, where we actually went out to community events and collected stories. And so this is a story bike created with 42 Design Fab here in Massachusetts. And we went out and recorded a few stories. I wanted to just quickly play a couple of stories just to give a sense. So this is one of the stories we collected at the Fresh Paint Mural Arts Festival with the story bike. And
downtown Springfield, everyone's having a great time. We got a number of things going on. We got White Lion Brewing, 350 Grill, Johnny Blaze Hot Dogs, and obviously Fresh Paint Springfield. We have murals throughout the city of Springfield. We have youth here. We have tremendous diversity, all ages, all ethnicities, all economic backgrounds, and that is in fact what local supporting local is all about. Everyone coming together to have a shared experience. So we're happy to be here. We congratulate Fresh Paint, and we look forward to 2020. Let's bring it back again.
And obviously, I love the enthusiasm in that story and just the story itself and how much it captures. Another quick story that we captured in Seattle at the Salmon Homecoming Festival. This is another one that I really like that we did at a pop-up exhibit.
Hey, my name is Raymond Monseeger. I'm from the Tlingit clan out of Juneau, Alaska. I love the waterfront, native pride, just the experience in general from being a part of culture. We have the Salmon Homecoming coming today, so it's going to be a great experience for my kids and everything else. That'll be tomorrow. My dad, actually, Raymond LaCourte Monseeger Sr., is actually one of the last native carvers to do it downtown. My Uncle Larry Smith / Beaver was the original carver. So just about respect and about everything. Everybody comes see the experience of different ethnicities and stuff that kind of shares the experience, because then it'll just bring more people and populate goodness instead of bad. So let's just take it as that, and I'm gone.
I love that story. Also, just so much is evoked by some of these stories when you hear them. So many personal connections. You see, emotionally connect with people, and I really appreciate that coming out of the stories. Just a few other quick intros. So this is one that we did with Washington Post magazine, where we set up a station on the National Mall and recorded people's experience of the National Mall. And then Washington Post magazine took some of those and printed them in the magazine. They also have an online version that that really came out well. And finally, so those are the pop-up modes. One other layer, the third layer that we've been focusing on, is the online layer. So since visitors currently aren't coming to many institutions, we have an online way that we can gather visitor stories by sending them an email and then having them record on their own device and submit that way. So the general idea is to have multiple approaches to catch people in different ways. One is the exhibit itself, one is a pop-up mode, and then the other way is an online mode. And as we start to think about museums becoming more community-centered, some of these other modes, I think, start to really play into things a lot more. And again, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but one of the key ideas that I've been thinking about is to shift from thinking about museum installations to thinking about community installations. And that's something that I think we could all sit on as we look and say, well, what am I going to do in this world? To sit and think, what if I didn't work for museums? What if I worked for communities? Or if I do work at a museum, what would it be like to really put the focus on communities rather than the exhibit? And they all still can tie together, but that's one of those main things that I've been thinking a lot about that I think could help us all as we sort of work through these new circumstances. And I think that was sort of the quick overview. Sorry, Kara, I didn't understand exactly what our order was, but I wanted to get those out there. So I don't know at this point if you want to go through other questions or how you wanted to do that.
Brad, thank you so much. I would love to actually give Penny and Sarah an opportunity. Before you guys jump on, though, I just want to comment. I am really inspired by your emphasis on communities that are surrounding our institutions. But I do want to shift gears a little bit and just see how Penny and Sarah have interpreted this idea of community stories and community voices in a recent project.
Hi, Penny here. So like Brad, I want to introduce a little bit of Sarah and my roles and what we do at the museum. We want to talk about one specific project that we worked on together at the Oakland Museum. Sarah was the curator, I was the experience developer, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the purpose of including community stories in that project and how we went about it. So I'll start by just saying that I am the Associate Director of Experience Development at the Oakland Museum of California on this particular project, which is called You Are Here, California Stories on the Map, which is really focused on maps as tools for sharing ideas and information and aspirations about places. Experience developers and curators work really closely together along with designers and project managers as the core team on our projects. Curators work a lot with objects and research and artists and other experts, and the experience developer really holds the role of making sure that all the stories that we have in the exhibition are personal and accessible and relevant, and that we're creating social spaces and social experiences so that we can bring our visitors of all types together to share their ideas and opinions about topics that are relevant in our community. So that's really how Oakland Museum thinks about and structures our project teams for all of our exhibitions, including this one. And I'm going to hand off to Sarah real quick. Yourself.
Hi. So I'm working from my phone my computer seems to be having some issues. So I'm going to keep myself on video off in order to better preserve my bandwidth. Sorry, actually, would it be all right? Give me one moment. I'm so
No problem,
sorry.
Sarah. Penny, if
Sarah,
we
yeah, while you work on your technical problems, maybe I'll talk a little bit about.
Yeah, hold on. I think I'm gonna try to rejoin.
All right. While Sarah works it out, I'm going to just, I'll welcome you back in just a second, Sarah. We're not hearing you right now. But really, in terms of this exhibition about maps, which Sarah will talk a little bit more about the big idea and some of the content framework for the project itself, because our big idea was about maps as tools that anyone can use, we wanted to make sure that we were giving opportunities within the exhibition, both to show people in our community who are using maps as tools to tell their stories and share their stories, but also give visitors an opportunity to do the same, to make a map and use it as a storytelling tool. So that's really what I'm going to be focusing on during this presentation, is those experiences that we developed in conjunction with the rest of the content. So now, Sarah, why don't you give it another try?
Yes, thank you for your patience. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, I switched to my phone. For some reason, my computer difficulty. So yeah, I think I want to just second what Penny said. This is a show that's not so much about science content. It's more about using the tools of science to make decisions and take perspective and try to understand what's going on in the world. And maps are a tool that's often associated with science. So we took this idea of maps as a tool for understanding and kind of explored it in two directions. One is, maps can be a tool for perspective taking from another individual person. They're a way for someone who you maybe don't know so well to share their experiences through this really unique form. Maps can also be a way of telling a collective story and looking at things from a very abstract perspective. So you can use maps to make the best possible decisions about where climate change is happening or where coronavirus is spreading. And so at its core, the show is really about using tools to take perspective and to try to understand the experiences of individual people and the experience of individual communities, and what are some of the ways maps can help us do that. Thanks, guys, for the patience.
Wonderful. Just as another person who works in a science institution, Sarah and Penny, it is true that I think oftentimes we separate people and data, and they are not separate, because people make data, right? And people use data. So I just think that's very fascinating. I wanted to know if you guys wanted to, do you have any visuals that you want to share about the OMCA? Please share some visuals with us if you would.
Yeah, we have some slides that support some of the other questions, some of our answers and examples for the other questions. So I'll just screen share as we come to those questions.
Excellent. Well, in that case then, I do want to move on to our next question, which is really thinking about getting people involved in exhibitions. So how do you generate prompts and invitations for story gathering? How much scaffolding do you feel is effective? And what is your process for developing prompts and invitations? I'm going to turn it back over to you, Penny, if that's all right.
Oh, absolutely. Sure. So prompts are what it's all about. I mean, that's really a good prompt, a good scaffold for response is what generates good dialogue among participants, and also really juicy answers. Really open-ended questions, yes, no questions. You get kind of weak and flat, thin answers too. And so we prototype. I mean, that's where it all comes from. And this is where I'm going to start screen sharing. Here we go, because I've got some pictures from prototyping. Is everyone seeing my screen okay? Awesome. So this is the entrance to the You Are Here exhibition. Sadly, it was only open for a month, before it opened February 14th, so not very many people have seen it. I know a couple of people in our audience got a chance to come by and see it while it was up. But it's within the Natural Sciences Gallery, so we created a portal to just let people know they were entering a new content space. One of the components where we're really collecting and asking for visitors to share their stories is in a project called the Atlas of Oakland. The whole exhibition is filled with maps made by individual artists, also by organizations or government entities or corporations. We have a broad variety of maps. And what we wanted to do was show the real breadth of ways that maps can be used. And so for the visitor contribution piece, for the visitor participation piece, we had a lot of conversations about what's going to really inspire people to participate, to share interesting stories, to share personal stories, and how big does the base layer have to be? All kinds of questions about this. So we set up several different prototyping events. We usually do these on Friday nights when we're open to the public with live music and food trucks and other things. It's a really fun, convivial atmosphere for people to participate. I had the great pleasure of having an intern this summer named Aisling Heenahan, who you can see here pictured with our big butcher paper and Post-it mock-up, inviting people to come over and share their stories. We put up a lot of different example maps, as well as a bunch of different prompts, and just sat out there and invited people to make maps with us for the night. And as we had these conversations with people, those questions that they were asking us and the way we were guiding them or leading them or opening things up or focusing in on things really helped us shape our thinking about what the goals of the project were, of this exhibit component, and what kinds of things we're going to get the best responses. We got some amazing maps back from people. The one on the left of your screen is a woman who shared a very specific story in places just of one day. And the one on the right, this young person shared a whole bunch of different venues where they've gone to see live music, which I loved, and came up with a bunch of different symbols from that. So we felt like we were on the right track with this. And then here it is as installed. We just invited visitors to share their Oakland story. And the display on the wall really has a breadth of things, including some that were commissioned from community members with stories about protests, about history, about music, about culture, from very individual viewpoints. So both examples and good questions, I would say, are key to coming up with and developing good prompts. Sarah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do want to just add a quick comment to that. So in addition to prototyping this story interactive, the Atlas of Oakland, we also wanted to give people multiple ways to interact, some with the content, some that were very low barrier to entry, and others that required a bit more investment, like the Atlas of Oakland. And so we in the Oakland Museum, we asked visitors to contribute in a verbal or written way pretty frequently. We wanted to do something that didn't make that same ask. So we had a giant base map, and we created a heat map with different prompts. And people could do something really simple, like add a dot to represent an experience that they had. So it's completely a non-verbal response. And so our current prompt, or the prompt that existed before the museum was shut down, was what places in Oakland are quiet and which places in Oakland are loud. And you have different dots to indicate the different noise levels. And at the same time, we had this sort of plan to rotate out the prompts to generate new maps every so often. So other questions that we considered were things like, where do you go to be alone, and where do you go to be in a crowd? Or what places have you felt joy, and what places have you felt unhappiness? So kind of creating these collective shared mapping experiences for people that don't require anyone to share anything personal, but in aggregate create this bigger picture of Oakland and require a pretty limited amount of participation from a visitor.
All right, I think we're ready to hand this question off to Brad.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Prototyping, I feel like, must be super important in all of the work that we do. Brad, do you have any thoughts to share about process when it comes to developing prompts for your story invitations?
Sure, yeah, and following up on Penny and Sarah, the theme of having good examples and good questions is one that always comes up. As I think about this, I was thinking back to a project I did many years ago at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago in the U505 exhibit. And there we had a station where people would come up and record their stories. It was near the end of the exhibit, and we were thinking, well, what should we ask? And we thought, well, the exhibit's about World War II, the U505 submarine. Let's ask if their families have any experience, in World War II. Did you have any relatives who served and that sort of thing? And what we found is we weren't getting many answers, and we were getting a lot of goof-off answers, which are always a sign that we're not really engaging visitors. And so we sat and just thought, well, what would be a question that you just couldn't resist, that you just right away you want to, oh yeah, I have an example on that. And we realized that the location of the station was after the submarine, and that a lot of people had just come out of the submarine. And they had walked through the little cramped quarters and saw where people slept and ate and all of that, and everything's so tiny. And so we thought we'd ask, what if we ask if people could live with their family together on the submarine for a week? And wow, we got some good and lively answers. The first one I remember is a girl telling about her brother's BO, and no, we definitely could not do that. But it was the theme that came out of that was proximity. Like, what else is around? What's people's experience when they get to this location where we're asking for their experience? And will they have experienced something else that we might be able to tap into? And as it turns out, Paul Orselli was asking me these questions about a month ago for his blog. And the video, I've got about a 20-minute video that I think my parents have watched, and some others. But Paul kind of astutely came up with what he called the 3 Ps of exhibit storytelling in our conversation. And those were proximity, like what's right around the station. Prompts, what are we asking people? Are we asking about a generalized experience like World War II that maybe some of their relatives served on, or are we asking something that really is specific and evocative? And also props. And so props was the 3rd P. And so I brought a little friend. This is a French puppet, and I'm going to promise to stop trying to speak in a French accent. But this is one that we did at the Mini Maker Fair in Boston, where we had these spoons where kids could just make designs on the spoon and then do puppet shows with each other. And people loved that. It really, when you have a prop to talk about, that makes a huge difference. And if you remember, one of the first slides I had was of shoes, where you show your shoes and talk about your shoes and the story of your shoes. So those things come to mind when I'm thinking about sort of props. And it's, not just props, but proximity and location, and the prompts as well. And I did want to quickly circle back. This is a little bit off topic, but I just want to quickly say, since I sort of messed up in the original order, in terms of a recent project that I have worked on, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Dog Tales exhibit with California Science Center. And that's another example where right away when you hear the prompt, tell us about one of your favorite experiences with your dog. People are going to have a response. I could think of so many memories myself. If you have a dog, you will have something that you want to talk about. The interesting thing there, and when I look at the server, all of these get uploaded to our server, and man, people were blowing the station out in terms of the number of stories recorded in the exhibit. People really resonated and responded with the topic of dogs. The interesting thing that happened, of course, was COVID-19. And right now I'm working with the center to add an additional layer to that exhibit where we're going to allow people to record on their own mobile phones, because we're thinking, are people going to really want to come up and touch the screen and record their story? The other advantage is they'll be able to do it from home as well. So that's another theme that I've been thinking about. How can we design for multiple level exhibits with different locations, where some of our audience is going to actually be in the exhibit, and some of our audience is going to be at home, or some will be at a program, and some will be at home. And so that's another one I think we could all just sort of collectively sit down with for an hour and just say, what does it mean to design for multiple locations? So that was a little detour. I wanted to take that little detour because that was one of the major themes, designing for multiple locations. But as well, I wanted to hit the 3 Ps and thank Paul Arcelli again for categorizing those.
Yes, and thank you to Lauren, who graciously popped Paul Arcelli's blog straight into the chat. So if anybody is interested in checking that out, there are lots of great stories from lots of colleagues in our museum world sharing all kinds of perspectives. It's really a wonderful blog. Thank you. This is, I'm hearing a lot about how the question itself, the seed question itself is really so important to be sure that you're getting a great story, and to really admittedly break down the fourth wall a little bit, even on this actual panel, us talking together about the questions that we wanted to work together on, I feel like is one of the great collaborative things about having, a multiple voice program. So moving on to this idea of multiple voices, let's talk a little bit about co-authorship. So I'm interested if, and actually Brad, I'm going to start with you. I'm interested if you could share with me some of your thoughts on co-authorships in your projects. What do you think are low barrier ways to incorporate community voices into projects? And what, in thinking about things that are projects that our audience might be working on?
Sure. And, I have the privilege of coming in after a lot of the work has already been done at museums and doing my installations. And from that perspective, I see a lot of the work is done sort of by the natural relationships that museums already have with other community organizations. They sort of building on their own natural partner organizations. And one museum that comes to mind is the Levine Museum in Charlotte. That's great about connecting out with community organizations. I provided a portable station that they took out to multiple locations and asked people questions about multicultural life in Charlotte. And there was, from my perspective, nothing magic about the technology. It was just it was a natural outgrowth of who are the partner institutions that the museum is already reaching out to and working with, and what's a format that provides a nice sort of palette for those organizations to input on. So pop-up exhibits come to mind as something that provides a really natural way that can be relatively easy or low cost to set up depending on what you're doing, and also draw in multiple partners. So that's one sort of thought. And you guys out there in the Bay Area have been doing a ton of great pop-up stuff for ages, acknowledging Maria Mortati, Nina Simon, and others. And I've sort of lost track of what you all are up to on that front. But definitely pop-up exhibits are a natural way to sort of bring in co-authorship and multiple voices. Another advantage about stories is that on a topic with multiple perspectives, the museum doesn't have to say, here's our perspective. It brings out this sharing space where stories from people are told by people. And, to be honest, there is some curatorship behind the scenes when you select which stories are you going to highlight. But still, I think that focus on stories is a natural connection, and when you're thinking about co-authoring. One other project that comes to mind is with the Museum of Durham History. And I wanted to acknowledge Katie Spencer Wright, and her work with the museum, where they reached out to the Al-Razak Islamic Cultural Center, which is one of the oldest mosques in North Carolina, and did a temporary exhibit with them on the life of the mosque. And so that provided a sort of natural way for them to reach out and gather stories from members at the mosque. And so they went over to the mosque and set up a station to record stories, and as well invited them to record on their own devices and submit. So that's sort of my perspective. Again, I sort of come in after a lot of the hard work has been done. But what I see is that museums are sort of naturally drawing on their partnerships and then using pop-ups and stories as ways of building those connections.
That's fascinating. I'd like to turn it over to Penny and Sarah. Can I invite you to share some thoughts?
Sure. And I'll kick this one off. You know, I think it's a really big question. It's a really important question right now. As we think about where museums come from and their history, their legacy, who works in museums, who controls which stories are being told, and who our audiences are, who museums are for. We talk about museums being for everyone. And I'm wearing my I Miss Going to Museums t-shirt, not my Museums Are Not Neutral t-shirt, which was the other one that I was choosing between the two for today's program. But this idea that we can take an objective stance, or that we're just a platform, is one of those fallacies that I think that museums have really need to be thinking hard about right now. The Oakland Museum, we have worked closely with community from the very start. We were founded 50 years ago as a museum of the people, and that aspiration has always been a guiding tenet for us, and we do better at it sometimes than others. We've kind of come up with a language that we use internally that we talk about the 3 C's as a spectrum of collaboration with folks who are not on our staff. So folks from community, as well as academic people or historians, artists, scientists. And the 3 C's range from co-creation, which is the deepest and most involved partnership around really authentically sharing authorship and power with folks who are not part of the museum, and helping them see what our constraints and our opportunities are, but really handing over the wheel to folks from outside to shape that story and decide what's going to be part of the way that story is told. That's the deepest one. The middle bracket is collaboration, where we work in partnership with folks, but really it's around constraints that we've developed and with a framework that we control, but always with a know about us without us mentality, where we don't feel comfortable telling people stories in the third person. We always need to and want to respect the experience of anybody whose story we're sharing, and have them be part of the process and control how that story is told. And then the lightest lift is contribution, and that really looks like the examples that Sarah and I shared already, where a visitor or a community member is loaning us an object, or writing or drawing something, creating an artwork for the project without really having a deep connection to the project itself. So that's kind of a long piece of background about how we approach that. You brought up co-authorship or co-creation, and we don't really have, this isn't a co-created project, the MAPS project. We have one piece that I'll put up on screen, an image from that we developed collaboratively with a community organization called the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, which is a grassroots community-led organization that's been for almost 20 years collecting environmental quality data, air quality data specifically, in the neighborhood of West Oakland, which is right next to the museum. And we included this story because they have partnered with various organizations both to develop air quality sensors that they could mount in backpacks and walk the streets of their neighborhood to collect on-the-ground data of everyday experience, and then mapping that data and collecting these maps and creating layers on these maps and analyzing these maps to really bring to light and into the public view some of the environmental challenges that are really clearly at issue in this neighborhood. And the image, the big photo on the wall is of West Oakland. You can see the BART tracks, you can see the Port of Oakland cranes, and homes and businesses right there in the middle of all of this. So what this has been able to do, what the maps have been able to do for them, is get them to the table with a lot of key players, and including the Air Quality Resources Board, and enact legislation around air quality management and some of the different protections that they can put in place in their neighborhood. So we brought them in because of maps, because it's a local story, it's a community story, and then we worked closely with them to pick and choose the specific maps, the pieces of their story, and get images and text from the organization and shape that to fit within the umbrella of the exhibition structure. So Sarah, you want to talk a little bit about involving other voices in this project as well, beyond the West Oakland EIP.
Yeah, so we, work with a pretty broad range of people and map makers and organizations that make maps to tell this story. And in some ways, our approach to connecting with community really came from the content and the way we kind of framed the show. So the show isn't about any specific map makers' maps or maps that tell a story about the environment or about social justice. It's about maps as a tool and the way anybody could use them to make a case for something or to share ideas or aspirations about something. And so that kind of necessitated us working with a broader range of people, maybe rather than going super deep with a single or a limited number of collaborators. And so our work in connecting with community looked a little different. Frequently at UMCA, there'll be a convening where people who are experts or have a lot of lived experience on a topic will come together, and there'll be kind of a day-long summit to kind of talk through the key issues. In this case, we kind of wanted a broader range of people. We wanted them to really be in dialogue with each other and bouncing ideas off each other and contradicting and disagreeing and upvoting each other's thoughts on these on maps and what maps can do and what their power is. And so in order to do that, we threw an event called Mappy Hour. I think you have a slide of it, Teddy. Yes. So Mappy Hour was a party / evaluation / convening. So we invited people from a range of institutions, including the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which tracks map evictions in the Bay Area and where people who are evicted end up living. We invited academics and writers and people who worked in museums and people who work for the Nature Conservancy to all come together and exchange ideas and generate sort of thoughts and frameworks around the exhibition. So the two images you have on the slide are a poster wall where we asked people to submit a map as their admission to Mappy Hour. And so we printed them up and then said, what else would you like to see? Or what do you think about these maps? And people kind of responded and had suggestions or thoughts. And on the right, you can see what's basically a card sort evaluation tool that we set up as a table game. So it was kind of like a combination of like party games that are also evaluation tools that also get people talking to each other. And so we have different ideas about maps, and people were supposed to sort them into, this is an essential idea that should definitely be in the show. This is a nice to have. This is so basic, it's almost boring. And we kind of looked at how people were categorizing the different content to get a sense of what we should prioritize for our visitors. So that way, this kind of built us a very big network of map thinkers. And it also helped us to reach out to a second round of mappers who are connected with the the attendees of Mappy Hour. So, you know, if we wanted to find someone who worked on geology mapping, we had a broad network of people who could help us find the right person. So this kind of snowball sampling helped us to really reach out to the map community at large and to find different people to contribute in different ways. Don't know if we have any additional Mappy Hour images. I think that covers it.
Yeah, the two that are up right now include Greg Carrot from the Mad Lab at Lighthouse for the Blind, who is one of our guests who also helped us incorporate more mapping and geolocating tools for the blind and visually impaired, which became a really key piece of the content of the exhibition as well. So, you know, I love this strategy that Sarah put together the activities for. I mean, I think we worked on it together, but I think it really was her brainchild as a fun way and a lighthearted way to bring a lot of voices into developing the content for this. So it wasn't just me and Sarah saying, oh, I think this is a really important idea. We had a broad network of folks who have an interest in map. We even had visitors that night who were knocking on the door saying, Mappy Hour, what's that? Can we come? So we knew that we were on the right track.
This is amazing. I am very tickled by the idea of having a Mappy Hour. That's very clever. But I'm also just really fascinated by the seemingly, you guys are using all of these different tools, and I just want to reflect back at all three of you that, you know, we're talking about technology, but we're also talking about, you know, using analog tools like sticky notes and cards and all of these different techniques that may seem archaic and arcane, like you guys are putting to use just to give lots of points of entry to lots of different people, and I just really admire that. I also, we are getting relatively close to our Q&A session of our talk tonight. So I do want to ask any of the attendees, if you are interested in asking our panelists some questions. We have a few questions already, but I'm going to give a last call, since we're talking about Mappy Hour, it's last call for your questions in the Q&A chat feature. Again, please use the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform to add any questions, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. But before we get there, I have one more question for our panelists. I'm going to kick it over to Penny and Sarah first, but I think it's now more than ever, it's incredibly important for us as museum professionals to explore ways we can capture visitor voice in the moment. What from your experience exemplifies how powerful community stories can be in an exhibition, and share with us an example of an unexpected response from a visitor that resonates with you.
All right, Sarah, I'm going to share my screen again so
Yes.
we can put the picture up.
Yeah, so I think Penny mentioned that we had made contact with Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired during Mappy Hour. And this is another case where those kind of contacts helped us to build something really interesting. So this is a map from a map maker, and she is a colleague of Greg Carrot's at Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired. And we just kind of gave everyone a general prompt about creating a map that shared their experience of Oakland. We kind of want people to give us their own kind of particular slice of Oakland as they experience it. So Amy Mason, this map maker, is visually impaired and recently moved to town. And she made this very beautiful map that's tactile. And so it's made with cotton balls and pipe cleaners and some printed paper that can, you know, have puffed areas. It's a common tool for making maps for visually impaired folks. And what I really like about this particular map is we didn't want Amy to have to speak, you know, about what it's like to be a disabled map maker. And she just made us a map about being new in town. But of course, her experience as a person with limited vision informs that experience, and the tools she used to make that map are, you know, kind of reflect that need and that way that she does her work. So we really liked this one because we felt like it was a genuinely different perspective than you might get, and just it was a chance to bring someone's voice into the picture who and just see how they experience the world in a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just add to that, because her map is fragile, you see it
Oh, yes.
here in this case. Our gallery guides and floor staff have a key to open the case if people request to touch Amy's map. She really meant it to be touched as well as seen. And we do have a touchable plastic, a 3D printed touchable version of it that's also accompanies it on the reader rail where it's located. So there's a full access one, but if you really want to get in there and feel the cotton and the pipe cleaners and all the other good stuff, you can ask someone to open the case for you. And then I wanted to, in terms of sort of like the fun diversity of great stories that we're getting as part of this project, also share just some of the delightful diversity of maps from the Atlas of Oakland project. So, you know, we were talking about scaffolding and prompts, and one of the things that I feel like we had great success with this project because we're getting wildly different maps that really reflect all of the different experiences and ideas and passions and joys that our visitors bring to us in the museum. So ones that have very specific literal stories that they're sharing about places that people have been or things that they've done. Really goofy ones like this marvelous alien and UFO sightings, not something that we would expect to see in the Natural Sciences Gallery of the Oakland Museum of California, but love that it's there and so beautifully crafted. And then my favorite one, which we also shared on social media, is this last one, the Keanu Reeves map of Oakland and San Francisco with the little red pills marking all of the different locations where they were shooting a new movie in town. And
I think it was The Matrix. It's The Matrix.
Oh, it's all the different places where The Matrix was shot, but aren't they working on a Matrix sequel? I think that's why it was top of mind.
Ah, yeah, I'm not aware of Matrix.
Anyway, sometimes I learn about current events from our visitors in the museum, things we didn't know already. So that's it from us. Over to you, Brad.
Yeah, Brad, again, you know, what is a powerful community story that resonates with you?
Sure. Yeah, you know, my mind gravitates to the eccentric and the unique and things that just like, wow, I had no idea that story was out there. One of the ones I had early on in installations was in a textile exhibit in Gaston, North Carolina. And I had just finished setting up the installation, and into the door walked two older women in their 80s. And the staff were so excited. It's like, whoa, it's Bertha Dunn. Bertha Fireballer Dunn. Her nickname was Fireballer because she reportedly had the fastest softball pitch on the Mill League teams back in the 1940s or whenever. And they had been looking for her for a while, wanted to get her, and she just happened to walk into the museum that day. And so she walked in, and the woman she walked in with was her catcher back on the Mill League team. And so they just told one fantastic story after another. The catcher, Utsi was her name, talked about how her hand was just like hamburger after catching Bertha's pitches. And, you know, those things, you never know what stories are going to come in and what experiences. One that I'm also thinking of was at the California Science Center in an exhibit on sort of the natural life in Los Angeles and people's experiences of nature in Los Angeles. And one of the ones I remember was a woman who talked about she had left her windows open in the night, and in the morning, 3 raccoons had come in through the windows and were eating her cat's cat food. And just like, you know, I guess it happens, but to hear someone actually talking about it is very evocative and like a reminder, oh, yeah, nature is here. Nature is looking for food. What are food sources? And then there was another story of a gentleman who taught pigeons, he trained pigeons, and they taught them to flip in midair. And apparently there's a certain a group of people who just do that. They teach pigeons tricks, aeronautical tricks. And so, those kind of stories that I never would have expected that come to mind. We can also think in a sort of bigger picture way, like, do these stories make any difference? Personally, I feel more enriched in my life, knowing about Bertha and knowing about the pigeons. But also it kind of brings up the question, what do we do with these stories? And is there a bigger picture that we can set up that actually gives real impact and real consequence to the stories? Again, I think back to the Levine Museum and their exhibit, Changing Places from Black and White to Technicolor, so that it was about multicultural life in the South, not just black and white, but Asian families moving into Charlotte and cultures from all over. And they took some of the stories and provided them to their local PBS station, who is doing a series on that topic throughout the year. So several times throughout the year, some of the stories would be fed over to local PBS. And again, the Washington Post magazine project, people love knowing that their story might appear in Washington Post magazine. So to have real interesting outcomes from stories is something that I think we could get a lot more mileage out of. I loved the examples of the maps and connecting those with topics, a wide ranging of topics from pollution to visual impairment and all other kinds of things. So just thinking about ways we are connected to other institutions, other organizations, again, thinking less about an exhibit and more about a community, designing less for an exhibit and designing more for a community is that theme that I've really been thinking about. And that other topic of what are some possible big outcomes? If we were to just sit back and say, what could we do with these stories that might make a difference? That's another one of those questions that it's just good to sit back on and think about.
Yeah, I find it really fascinating. Just as we've been talking through this entire program, a lot of things that have sort of been coming up is these kind of pieces that are being formed out of this. So either story recordings or our mysterious fourth panelist that appeared about halfway through the beginning from your side, Brad, our spoon there. But interestingly enough, I'm going to dive into some of our audience questions, and it sort of fits that the very top question is concerning what happens to these things after exhibits close. So asking it directly, what happens to collected stories, prompt responses at the close of an exhibit? And I feel like this is for everyone. So since Brad, I'm looking at you now, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. A lot of museums put their stories up to YouTube, which is a handy place to save them and to know that YouTube is probably going to be making sure these can be played back for a while. Interestingly, I'm working on a project with an arts organization in Florida that's celebrating its 50th anniversary. And so we're loading the stories into this sculpture that's going to be a time capsule for 50 years and then opened up after 50 years. Technically, I'm not sure exactly what's going to go on, except that it's probably going to involve having some copies of the stories in different formats in a safe deposit box or other things. To think about what can we do with these after the exhibit. Obviously, saving them up in social media in some way, and then ideally pinging back to them now and then, the way that Facebook might say 3 years ago, blah, blah, blah. A museum could as well jump back to some of the stories recorded and bring those back to life. But yeah, I think that's a topic that would be really good to explore more. And I don't think a lot is happening on that right now. A lot of it tends to be, here's the exhibit and let's get it for the exhibit.
Thanks, Brad. I'm going to jump in because for me, it raises some questions around ownership and authorship. You know, I think, for example, for the community commissioned maps that we put up in the Atlas of Oakland project, we have specific permissions, and we're pretty careful about documenting what the rights and reproduction permissions for anything that people loan to us or create for us. So at the end of the exhibition, we'll return those to the people who made them because we know who they are and we have that contact information. We worked with them to create them. So as far as I'm concerned, those are their artworks and we'll go back to them. For other things that we reproduce, we similarly are really careful up front to manage expectations around how work will be shared. And in the case of prompts, you know, post-it notes or maps that people have made, I think I'd have to think hard about using them beyond the exhibition because they're anonymous and because we don't have the capacity or a mechanism for providing attribution to their makers. That's my thought. Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, I agree on that pretty wholeheartedly. And I also think an exhibition is a very specific context. And so we're asking for people to respond to very specific prompts. This question actually came up with an exhibition that was several years ago on cannabis in California. We had a confessional and people talked about, you know, interesting or crazy or, you know, serious experiences they had. And some museums asked if they could borrow some of those responses. And we felt that taking them out of context, you know, you go into a confessional booth and you drop it secretly into a ballot box, you know, is you're trusting the museum with your story in a very different way, and repurposing it would be potentially a breach of trust for people who participated in that that interactive in good faith that their story was going to kind of be privately seen by museum staff.
Yeah, again, going back to this idea of co-authorship and, you know, really trying to distribute ownership across everybody that you're working with. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to another question, which is, I think, first directed at you, Sarah, which is, could you please speak to how you brainstorm the list of your Mappy Hour participants, and how do you ensure that you get diverse perspectives coming to the table?
Yeah, we definitely looked for Mappy Hour participants in a variety of ways. So one, you know, the Oakland Museum has pretty strong relationships with a lot of community organizations. And so we asked our colleagues, who have you worked with from other projects you think would want to contribute? And so Eric Arnold, who made our hip hop map on the wall, also, you know, contributed similar work to the Black Panthers exhibition. We also included in our Mappy Hour survey, when we invited people, we had them submit a map as their sort of price of admission. Then we also asked them to suggest other people that we might reach out to. So we had a second layer of people who kind of came in after the first round of invitations went out because their colleagues had recommended them. And so we got people who worked on education policy and people who worked on a variety of, you know, housing policy things. And so through the networks of our colleagues and the networks of our map collaborators, we were able to build a more diverse network of people. Although I think always we want to try to, you know, be mindful of that and continue to interrogate what we're doing and are we missing good ways to reach people.
And chiming in, when we were thinking about Mappy Hour and who'd be interested in coming, as Sarah said, we built that network through the network. But some of the folks that we were tapping initially are people who are already doing a lot of work in community, like Open Oakland or other community organizations that are leveraging the power of maps to make change in Oakland. So I think that because we were working initially with people who are very connected and work to make connections as part of their work, we were able to really capitalize on their relationships as well. It was great.
And, you know, as I think about it, this could also be where pop-up exhibits have a lot of power to go out to community festivals and events and, you know, gather and build connections there. I think there's a lot of potential. The project we did with Friends of Waterfront Seattle at the Salmon Homecoming Festival comes to mind as an example of ways of connecting out more broadly.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it is always a challenge, and like you say, Sarah, just reinterrogating our own processes over and over, I think is very important. More audience questions are coming in. So we have a question: as we're all in the midst of this pandemic, how has it been for you to continue your exhibition development work with community? For example, have you found a shared energy and agenda to keep working on a project, or to rework or reimagine a project, or to put a project on hold? This person would love to hear about what is happening right now for you, all three of the panelists, and not only the pre-pandemic examples. So bringing it right up into current times. So Brad, if it's all right, I'd like to start with you. What are you doing now?
Sure. Yeah, it was really, again, I want to acknowledge what a huge impact this has had on us all, and that I don't have the answers. And I'm also out there trying to figure it all out, and hopefully collectively we can make our way to next steps. But there are some interesting things that have happened. So I did have a few projects that were already in motion that we quickly retooled in ways. So for example, I'm working with a library, the Kingston Public Library in Massachusetts, that's developing this community story center. So the idea is people come in, they bring their library card, scan their card, and then tell a story and record a story. And so we still are going ahead with that. But as soon as COVID-19 came out, we realized people are not going to be coming into the library. And so that's when we kind of redoubled our effort to getting out this recording on users' own devices. And so that's something that I personally have really kind of spent a lot of time sort of retooling and rethinking that, wow, if we can't really count on people's physical presence in an exhibit, what can we do and what can I do personally? So that's why I was thinking more about that. Well, let's continue the story mission, but let's reach people in their homes. Let's have them record on their own devices. I'm sure there are a lot of non-technological examples of that too, but that idea of, how do we reach out? And personally, what do I do with my career? How do I shift my career to focus on that as well as a huge thing? And I'm still getting inquiries about museum exhibits. And so, it's still, people are still thinking a year down the road. I think it's going to be very different and maybe not as much funny. But again, that's another reason why I think it's so important to think less about exhibits themselves and more about communities or exhibits in the context of a community. And I have several others where that exact thing happened. We had this plan to get this station installed in the exhibit, but whoops, that's not going to happen. Let's do this online thing instead.
Yeah, Penny, do you look like you were about to say something? Come on in, Penny. Share some thoughts.
Sure. I was going to try and poke Sarah, but I'll poke her next. Yeah, obviously we're all in that uncomfortable space right now, right? We're living with a lot of ambiguity. We're living with a lot of concern for our colleagues and our community members. And as an organization, OMCA is doing a lot of things at once. Mostly we're trying to figure out how and when we can bring our staff back to our building safely, so that we can start re-envisioning the public experience. Some of that work is going on in the background. But then in terms of the bigger question of how can we be of service to our community in this moment, we are thinking about how our space might be used differently, because it's one of our biggest assets. And it also, under the current health guidelines, comes with a whole lot of constraints. We're also working you know, one of the opportunities that came to us that we're really excited to be part of is working in partnership with Black Cultural Zones and Art Murmur and other partners in the city of Oakland in a support role to figure out how the murals that have gone up in downtown Oakland, the protest murals on the storefronts up and down Broadway and other parts of the city, sparked by the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests around the murder of George Floyd, how that artwork, that much of which happened spontaneously and in a disorganized fashion, how that can be preserved or conserved or potentially exhibited in the future. So it doesn't just, that the record of that moment doesn't go away. We're also talking about how we collect this moment and what are the ethics of that, and what are the logistics of that, what are the right pieces to preserve, and where are they coming from and whose stories do they represent. So projects that were in development that are in the pipeline, we're continuing with projects that were close to completion. So the things that were scheduled to go up this spring, including a show called Hella Feminist, and another big project called Mothership that's about Afrofuturism. Those are still, we're still working on redesigning those and reconceiving them for the current constraints around interactivity and the amount of space and capacity that we can have, that people can use, with the hope of putting them up when we do come back into the building. But we don't have a hard date for that, and our primary concern really is around the health and safety of our staff, and being of service to our community.
Of course, of course. Sarah, to poke you a little bit, do you have anything that you want to add?
Yes, so I think there's a couple things. You know, one, I can just say that, you know, unexpected positive, I think we're all trying to find silver linings in this very, very difficult moment. But in my new role at the Exploratorium, I work on one of the Global Studios projects, and there's some work around engaging communities abroad in the places where the museums that we're building will actually be installed. And I think that because we've all become accustomed to doing everything on Zoom and doing things remotely, I actually think that those projects might progress in a very different way because we're all living our lives online and distances really collapse due to, you know, our new Zoom lifestyle. So I think that I'm hoping that that can be a positive going forward and help us to do some more outreach to community organizations that can support some of the messages and ideas that will be part of those exhibitions. So stay tuned. I'll let you know how that really plays out over time. And then more generally, I think, you know, if I'm of course very sad that the MAP show isn't really available to the public in the same way that we had hoped, but it has found a very nice online home for the time being. So I want to give a shout out to my OMCA colleagues for hustling to get it on the internet. And in some ways, the work of the MAP show is being done by all of us. You know, one of my goals for the show was to have people really think about, you know, what are the affordances of a tool like a map or a tool like data collection, and what are the limitations? And when should we trust data, and when should we ask critical questions of it? And, you know, I think there are times when our culture, both from progressive perspectives and from conservative perspectives, can be a little bit anti-data or a little bit anti-science or distrustful of science. And I think all the tough conversations we're having about what do maps really show, you know, what does an infection rate really mean? How are we measuring it? Like, in some ways, we went on to have those conversations as a country, map show or no map show. And so in a very short time, America really caught up to the conversations we wanted people to have with the show. So there's a little bit of an irony there that we were making this case for maps and data and reasoning with maps and data. And then all we do now is hit refresh on maps on our computers. But I think it's good if this can give people some tools to process those or to ask really interesting questions about them, then that's a good thing in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. We all have had to pivot so quickly. And it is nice when we can find easy connections between the work that we're doing and our audiences, despite this very big digital shaped barrier.
If I can, Kara, I just want to jump in. Sorry to
please.
interrupt, but some of our practice of creating good prompts and scaffolding activities for visitors to do, to respond to, and draw or write or create videos have now translated over to the digital sphere. So the UMCA at Home website, we have lots of activities that people can be doing at home, including a lot of birding activities, and the maps exhibit has an online home, and we're still encouraging people to make their maps of Oakland and submit them digitally and tag us with them. So those same tools are now part of our social media connection with our community.
Mm. You know, that kind of reminds me, one of the other projects I'm working on is with Creative Discovery Museum in Chattanooga, and they have a pretty huge distance learning initiative. And as we think about how do we deal with this, are there ways that we can take some of what we're doing in museums and create content for distance learning? That's huge. Parents are so hungry for things, especially for their kids to do, and teachers as well. So that's another avenue that I'm playing with in the back of my mind to think, well, let's see, distance learning in museums. That seems like a nice niche. Yeah, that's another potential out there.
You know, and just to add a little bit of my own experience, you know, NASA already has a big online presence. And so the particular realm that I work in is really focused on physical exhibits. So we have gone and worked with we are turning and working with our digital partners in the hopes of trying to give them some context about how to engage people's physical bodies when they are not physically engaging with our products. So how can we continue to have that kind of physical connection with people? I think we have time for one more question. And so this question is, remote learning, as we've been talking about, is becoming critically important for at least the coming academic fall term and perhaps beyond. So these ideas and techniques seem to be an excellent match for museum partnership with teachers, school districts, and communities to incorporate the remote learning. Brad, you just briefly mentioned this, but I'm curious if you want to expand on this a little bit more, and then I'll kick it back over to Penny and Sarah for their thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, no, this is a project I've been working on with Creative Discovery Museum for many years, funded by the Department of Energy, focusing on biofuels and bioproducts. And so originally we developed an iPad app, a sort of learning game that was distributed so that teachers could use it in the classroom, or museums might use it on family night and things like that. And so it just struck me, of course, 2-3 months ago, like, wow, this is like a major thing to think about. How do we take this because I have a son who's in middle school, and I know how hungry parents and teachers are for activities, meaningful, fun, engaging activities for kids at home. So again, I would just wholeheartedly reinforce the idea that this is really so much potential for museums. And then the question is, what are some of the formats that work with what the museum has already developed internally to get it out there to homes? And so that's a great area for exploration. I'm thinking a little bit about it, a lot of other people as well.
So I can mention the work of one of my experience development colleagues and one of our other teams within the the Gallery of California Art, one of our 3 core galleries at the museum. We have a display of posters. We have a huge collection of posters at the museum. And when it was initially installed almost 10 years ago, we did a lot of work with community groups in person to sit and meet with people and talk about which posters spoke to them and why, and how the different messages. A lot of them are political in nature. Some of them are protests. Some of them are from organizations advertising events. Some of them just carry community-minded or political messaging. And so we worked with community groups. I say broadly, I wasn't with the museum at the time, to pull out posters that resonated and include label text from those individuals or those organizations about why that poster spoke to them. And so that's been part of the installation. We're about to reinstall that poster wall, in part because of some conservation concerns, and looking to do it more frequently in the future. And so the team has been working with a couple of teachers at Berkeley High School who picked up on this idea really, really easily and really fastly, and using some examples from that poster collection that were pulled out by our curator and experience developer, developed a curriculum unit in the spring around designing, writing good messages, causes that you want to support, speaking up, finding your voice, expressing yourself. And so these high school students used those posters, wrote about why they resonated for them, designed their own posters. And then we've recently learned that some of those posters actually were used in the recent protests that came out of that curriculum unit. So we're hoping to be able to capture that whole arc as part of the reinstallation when we do reopen. So I couldn't agree more that these practices around working with formal ed, with community organizations, with individuals, really bring a lot of meaning and content, both inside our walls, in our galleries, and out in the community.
Oh, that's like a wonderful example, Penny. Thank you so much for sharing it. That's happy. And yeah, it's just great to hear both of those examples. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Exploratorium has quite a number of online learning activities, like a very deep pocket when it comes to that work. And I actually use them myself when I'm writing labels and can't get to the museum because it's shut down. So I've built many of them, and I can attest to the fact that they work. And so if you're looking for science content, I can direct you to no better place than there. I would also just say that I think a lot of what we do in our exhibits, we're often leveraging tools that were developed for online conversations. So the idea of like upvoting or having a conversation wall or like a message board, we're often trying to replicate that experience in 3D in a gallery. I feel like sometimes the best work I've done as an exhibit developer is just analoging digital interactives. So we now have this opportunity to really use those tools in their native environment for online learning. And so as much as it can feel unfamiliar, I think we're actually, a lot of the prompt writing or the shared, collecting of stories are things that, that we're already doing naturally and can move easily back into their native digital environment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's amazing. All of these tools, even though we don't have physical access to our institutions, a lot of these tools still apply. So thank you very much, Penny, Brad, and Sarah, for sharing a little bit from your perspective. And we are just about at the end of our program. We have 2 questions left. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to them right now. But we will try to get an answer back to somehow back to attendees. So thank you to all of the attendees for joining us tonight. I want to give an extra special thank you to Penny, Brad, and Sarah for joining me and Cultural Connections on this great conversation, More Than One Character, listening to and sharing community voices. It's been a real pleasure hosting this discussion with the 3 of you. The 3 of you are such incredibly inspiring individuals, and your work is really very fascinating. I highly encourage all of our attendees to head over to OMCA's page, to Exploratorium's page, to Brad Larson's page. You can see a lot of those links on the actual event the event page on Cultural Connections. The website for Cultural Connections for future events is cultural-connections.org. Again, thank you so much for joining me today, and we will sign off. Have a wonderful evening, and everyone be well. Thank you.